Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to chat a little bit about a recent deck culling that I did. So over the last couple of months, I've been kind of culling through my collection, moving things into a purgatory box, and I've recently gone through the purgatory box and made my final selections. So I had a total, or have a total, of 75 decks that I'm going to be rehoming. That is roughly a third of my collection. And one of the reasons that I wanted to cull my collection was because I got to thinking about how I have so many decks in my collection that I absolutely love and enjoy working with and work with quite frequently. And then I have this whole section, roughly 75 decks, worth of decks that I like, but I just don't use that often, or I don't really love, or I have other things in my collection that have taken its place. So because showing you 75 decks would be ridiculous, and I haven't even gone through the whole process of putting them all together and getting them ready to move on to new homes, what I thought I would do today is just share with you the top 10 most surprising decks that actually ended up in my purgatory box and are going to be leaving my collection. Now, these are decks that might surprise you, but they definitely surprised me that they ended up in there, and I gave them a lot of thought, but I decided ultimately that it was time for them to move on. So I thought I'd share those with you today. So I thought we'd start with the sort of least surprising deck, I suppose, of all of them, even though there are, quite a few other decks that are going to be moving along. This is the Everyday Witch. We know this deck, right? I edged it. I am kind of surprised by this one only because it's such a solid reader, right? It reads really, really well. I did really enjoy getting to know it. I did really enjoy spending time with it. But here's the thing. I spent that month with it. I worked with it, and then I put it back on the shelf, and I haven't touched it since. And that's been quite a while. Like a half a year. So, the thing is with this deck, even though it's totally different artwork, totally different energy than the Green Witch Tarot, I find that whenever I'm looking for a sort of Rider-Waite-Smith inspired witchy deck, I always end up going to my Green Witch Tarot. It never fails. So this one I'm just hanging on to, and it's just taking up space in my collection, and I don't ever reach for it. I don't ever use it. It's not that I don't like it. It's not that I don't think it's really cool. It's just I reach for the Green Witch every time instead. Even when I think, I'll pull this one out and I'll use it. Nope, I end up getting out the Green Witch again, and that just is what it is. So this one is basically going to be finding a new home just because I don't ever use it, because even though it's a totally different energy, a totally different art style, for me personally, it does actually compete with the Green Witch Tarot in my collection, and it loses every time. And that is probably because I have had the Green Witch Tarot for a really long time, and I just have a personal connection to it. So that one was a little surprising to me just because it's, such a solid reader, but again, I don't use it. So moving along, as we move along, we're going to get more and more surprising, I think, at least for me. This is the Second Nature Tarot. Now, this is an independently produced deck, and I adore the artwork. It's so quirky and so cute. And I have had some really fun readings with this deck, and I had it for like a year all on its own. But then here's the thing. Last year, I got the creator's other deck, the Distant Past Tarot, and for whatever reason, that deck just clicks way better for me. Now, the decks aren't the same, right? They don't have the same energy. They're not... They don't even feel like they really occupy the same space. So it's kind of weird that I'm looking at them as I pull one over the other, but that just seems to be what happens. Sometimes we have reactions and connections with decks, and I just really can't explain it, right? This deck is super quirky. It's super cute. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy my work with it, but I tend to just pull my Distant Past Tarot instead. I do also have other kind of fun, quirky, collage-y decks that I tend to be drawn to more often than this one. Again, nothing against this deck, nothing against any of the decks that I'm going to be sharing with you today. They are all fabulous decks, which is why they are such a surprise, right? You know, when we do these callings and we're like, you know, I pulled out like a ton of mass market oracles and stuff like that. That's not really a surprise. I found like I had like, you know, 9 herbal decks. Who needs 9 herbal decks? I don't. So I pulled out a bunch of those that I don't need and things like that. But what makes this selection, this group, these 10 decks special or different or surprising is because they are decks that really do stand on their own and have been wonderful parts of my collection for the most part. This one I have edged in this super fun gradient green colors with a little bit of gold overlay to match the backs. It was a lot of fun to do that. And it's a deck that I really, really enjoy, but I just find that I don't reach for it very often. And this is kind of one of those cases of I'd rather just move it along to somebody who would enjoy working with it and would give it more time and attention, which is pretty much the case with all 10 of these decks. I just want them to find better homes with somebody who will love them and use them. So the third deck in this little surprising collection is the Muse Tarot. Now this is the mass market edition, so in that sense there's really nothing, you know, super fabulous or exciting about this deck. I haven't even edged it. Like there's nothing super special in that sense. But here's the reason why it's leaving my collection and a little bit of a surprise. I did use this deck a lot for creativity work, and it works beautifully for that. And I did have some great readings with it, some great work that I did in terms of creative projects and tapping into creativity and all of that kind of good stuff. But I have found that there's another deck that has really kind of taken the place for that for me in my collection. And so I'm not using this one like ever. I will have to say that the Kings going the other way did annoy the crap out of me. I mean, it still does. That's nothing new. And the only other thing about this deck is that it is full of very young, very beautiful people. So there's no age diversity, which is really starting to bother me the older I get. There's no age diversity. There's not really any body diversity. There's very little diversity in skin tone. There's only a couple cards really that hit that mark. And it just, I'm kind of over that. Like I have a couple decks that I keep that I make an exception for. Star Child and Moon Child, I'm looking at you. Those fit right into the same category of people who look like they stepped out of a magazine. And this to me is not the world I live in. Like not even creatively, it's not the world I live in. So while I love this deck, like, I love the concept of this deck, and I think the artwork is beautiful and it's very well done. I have found that over time, as I've worked with it more and more, it's kind of lost favor in my collection. I'm kind of just over this type of world, this type of magazine beautiful. I don't live in that world, like, at all. That's not my world. I'm not young, I'm not modern, I'm not hip, I'm not cool. And this deck doesn't really represent anything that even remotely looks like the landscape that I inhabit. And as far as being a creativity deck, I have decks that fit that much better for me. So I know that kind of sounds like I'm dissing on the deck. It's a beautiful deck, really, really is. But I am trying to be honest about why I'm moving some of these decks along. Anyway, that's kind of what's surprising about this one to me is not so much the fact that it's leaving my collection. I'm really not surprised about that at this point. What's surprising to me is how my relationship to this deck has changed and how things like that, how things like the world that this deck inhabits, I want things that reflect more of the world that I know. Otherwise, I can't make a connection to it. Hopefully that makes sense. So the next deck that has been kind of a surprise to end up in my purgatory box is the Archetypes deck. Now, part of the surprise with this deck is because I spent a long time modding this deck, right? It was a round deck. I don't do well with round decks, so I made it this weird shape. I took some sides off of it so I had something to hang on to so I could riffle shuffle it. I edged it. And I do really like this deck, but I feel like it kind of had its time and its place in my collection, and I haven't touched it in a really long time. Again, I have other decks that I feel kind of inhabit this world and this energy for me that I am more apt to turn to when I need that kind of an energy. The guidebook is amazing, and I've kind of hung on to it just because of the guidebook, but I'm kind of at this point where like I don't want to keep decks just for a single card because I like that one card. I don't want to keep decks just because, oh, it's cute. I don't want to keep decks just because I like the guidebook. I'm kind of at this point in my collection where everything needs to kind of click for me in order for me to want to keep it, because I do have a lot of decks, and I have a lot of decks that work really well for me. So there's not a lot of benefit to me keeping decks that kind of work, or this piece of it works, or that piece of it works. So this is a case where I do like the artwork, and I think it's cool, and the concept of the deck is cool, and the guidebook is really cool. It's just not one that I use very often. And I'm just not drawn to work with it. I feel like it kind of had its time and its place in my practice, and I've moved on from it. And my surprise about this deck is really just because of the amount of time I spent modifying it. But, you know, maybe somebody else will enjoy it. It's all trimmed down if you don't like round decks. I don't either, so here's this one no longer round. But again, just another little surprise just because of the amount of time I spent modifying it. But I do feel like it's just time for it to move on. I feel like I've had my time with it, and I've gotten what I needed to out of it. So, okay, so next we have an out of print deck that I've hung on to forever. This is the Jolanda Tarot. This is the one that had those big purple borders all the way around. And this was one of the first, not the first mod, but one of the first mods that I've done. I actually got it really, really straight, surprisingly. And I took the purple borders off it. This deck is super cool. It is out of print, and I do really, really love the artwork, but I rarely use it anymore. Again, this is another one that I feel like it kind of had its time and its place in my collection. I used the heck out of it for a while. And then I've got other decks that came in that kind of fit the same bill for me. And I just end up using those more often than I turn to this one. In fact, I haven't had this one out to read with it in well over a year, possibly two. So it's been a while. It's been a while since I've worked with it. And again, this is just, it's an interesting deck. It's an out of print deck. And why am I hoarding it just to have it? That's silly. I'm not using it. I might as well pass it along to somebody who is wanting to use it. I mean, I do have decks in my collection that I keep for sentimental reason or collector purposes that I don't use, but I know that going into those decks. This was not a deck that I bought to just have for a collector's. This was a deck that I bought to use, to trim obviously and to use, and I did for a while, but again, it hasn't seen the light of day in forever, and so I feel like it's time for it to move on to somebody who will love it and appreciate it. Again, it's trimmed and edged. So yeah, super cute little deck though. Like, it's like pocket size now. Okay, now we're starting to get into the oh my goodness territory with these next 5 decks. Yeah, I had 5 decks that were kind of like, yeah, it's a little surprising, but you know, I get it, right? And then we have 5 decks that I'm like, at first I was like, I cannot believe I put these in the purgatory box, but I didn't get them back out. And that to me is the key. They've been in there for a very long time. This is the darkness of light. I know. Here's the thing. I do not like the cardstock of this deck. It is I believe this is the 2nd edition, I want to say. It's the one with the black backs and has the black borders. And it's got a weird bow kind of this away. Like, it didn't bow like a normal, like if you riffle shuffled it bow. But at any rate, I can't riffle shuffle this deck, and I have a really hard time working with it because of the cardstock that it is and as stiff as it is. And so even though I think the artwork is absolutely stunning, I have other Rider-Waite-Smith clones in my collection, which is basically what this is. And I have other clones that I go to, or let's not say clones, let's say inspired. I have other RWS inspired decks that I will go to first because the cardstock is easier to work with. And some of them, it's the case of like, the artwork is even better in this deck, right? It's not because the artwork is better in those decks, it's because I can physically work with them easier, and this is just not something that I really want to fight with. You know, same as I've said of my Pagan Otherworlds, that one hasn't, I don't know where that one stands. It almost ended up in this collection, but we're not quite there yet. I'm stubborn. Anyway, I have other RWS inspired decks that have artwork that isn't even near this pretty, but it's easier for me to work with. I can shuffle it, I can use it, I don't struggle with it, and so I will go to those every time. And this deck has sat in the bin for a very long time. Truth be told, it's been kind of unused for over a year. And so I think I'm just ready to move it on because it's beautiful and somebody will love it and want to work with it all the time. And I don't know why I'm just keeping it just to have it, because I have other decks that I go to that I just prefer working with, even though this artwork is beautiful. But physically, this is one of those decks that if it was on some different cardstock and maybe a little bit smaller, I might keep it. But with the way that it is, I have other decks that work better for me. So I'm not going to hold on to decks just because, you know, oh, it's pretty. Well, pretty doesn't do me any good if I can't actually use it. So another point in case with this deck, this is the Revival Art Tarot. And this is another case of a deck that is stunning, but I have a really hard time working with it. It is too big for my hands. I'm not really fond of the backs, but the thing is when I want a deck that has art like this, this type of artwork, I tend to either go to the Victorian Romantic if I want something a little bit lighter, or I go to my Influence of Angels. And I know those aren't the same, right? Influence of Angels is like a photo collage type of deck with just kind of Renaissance style art. But it has the same kind of vibe, the same kind of energy to me. I'm not a fan of a lot of the images in this deck. I mean, some of them are stunning. This was one of the cards that I was like, I'm going to keep the deck just because I love that card. That's so stupid. There are 77 other cards in this deck. I'm not going to keep it just for one or two or three. Some of the images don't really align with the way that I read the tarot as well. And so, I mean, these are just really minor nitpicky things, right? I'm getting really, really nitpicky now. But here's the thing. If I don't get really, really nitpicky, which is kind of where I've been, the space I've been in the last couple of, well, let's be honest, the last year, then I end up with a ginormous collection full of decks that I never use. And I'm not necessarily a deck collector. I don't have decks just for collection purposes. I do have a very select few that I have just for collection. I don't read professionally, so I don't need to have a huge arsenal of decks at my disposal. So that really doesn't make sense for me in the way that I work with the tarot. I like having a larger collection so that I have lots to choose from and that I can have lots of different decks for different energies or for different works and different practices. But I had 75 of them that I wasn't using, like, at all. And so that, to me, that's a little much. And this was one of them because I have other decks that I go to instead, because this one is just, again, like Darkness of Light. It's beautiful, but it's difficult for me to work with. And so I just don't. I go to the decks that are easier for me to get my hands on and for me to work with. So another surprise deck, which this one honestly has gone in and out of my purgatory box I don't know how many times over the last couple years. I'm sure you'll recognize the backs. This is the Sacred Creators Oracle, and this is the Indie edition. It has the matte gold gilding, which is beautiful. Here's the thing with this deck. I really did enjoy working with it for quite some time. The cards don't quite lay flat anymore. You see they have they rock. But I really, really enjoyed this deck for a while when I first got it, and I used it quite a bit, but I've just found that I have other decks that kind of serve this purpose and work better for me in my collection. And here was my final kind of deciding factor when it came to whether or not it was time to let this deck go. This deck is now available mass market. I don't love the cardstock so much in the Indie edition that, like, I would be heartbroken to not have it in this cardstock. I think I would be perfectly happy with the mass market edition of this deck. So therefore, if I want this deck in my collection to make use of, I can just go out and purchase the mass market edition. There are people out there who would really love to have the Indie edition of this deck because they really want this particular cardstock or they really want the matte gold gilding. And I don't really care that much. So I'm not going to hoard this deck and hang on to it on the off chance that I might someday need it, when I can go purchase the mass market edition if I need it, and someone who is specifically looking for the mass market or the indie edition with this particular cardstock could have this deck and enjoy it. So that was really my deciding factor, was that like, if I want it, if I want to use it, I can buy the mass market. I don't care that much about the cardstock to warrant keeping it. I only bought it in the indie edition because at the time that was the only available edition. It hadn't come out mass market because I bought this deck several years ago. So I'm ready to let someone else have a turn with this deck. Somebody else who's looking for this particular edition. I do not have the original box, but I do have the guidebook that came with it, and of course the bag. So that's where I'm at with this one. I do like it. I don't use it much, and I feel like somebody else would appreciate the indie edition way more than I do. Okay, we're getting down to the last two, which are the most surprising. This is the Mythic Tarot. I know. It is the 1986 original Mythic Tarot. Here's the thing with this deck. It's super cute. I did trim it. I haven't edged it yet. But I did trim it. I did a whole mod. Well, I actually modded Lisa's deck on camera in a mod with me. But I had it and I modded mine as well. The artwork is charming. It really, really is. But I think this was one of those instances where I wanted the deck, I got the deck. Now I don't use the deck. I think it was just one of those, like, I just thought I wanted it because, I don't know, I couldn't have it. Maybe it was a FOMO thing. I really did think I would work with it because I really do like these images, but I just don't. And again, I have other decks that I tend to be more drawn to if I want a deck with this particular theme or style. So again, why am I holding on to it? Somebody else. I mean, granted, it's trimmed. I trimmed it, but if somebody else is looking for, you know, the 1986 edition of the Mythic Tarot and they wanted to trim it, this is already done. I do have the book. I do not have the original box. It was not worth salvaging, to be perfectly honest. That card is awesome. Love that one. Anyway, so yeah, that's why I'm moving this one along, because I don't use it and somebody else will enjoy it and love it, and it should be enjoyed and loved. So that's my thinking there. And that brings us to number one, which was the most surprising deck that I pulled out of the box. And that's the Majestic Earth Tarot. This one, it surprised me. It did and it didn't. Because this is, I think, one of the, when they found some more, there were factory seconds or something like that, I snagged a copy of it. This one definitely could have been in that tag, the 7 Deadly Sins, where it's like the deck that everybody had that you wanted. This definitely was one of those cases for me. I hate the gilding. If I was going to keep this deck, I would take the gilding off. But this deck, as beautiful as it is, just does not connect for me. I cannot work with it, and I have tried and tried and tried and tried. And it just, there's such a disconnect between me and this deck. It doesn't work for me. It almost feels too expansive. I feel like I get lost in it. And I don't really have any other way to describe that besides that. It just doesn't connect. And I feel like I'm lost in these images, and it's too expansive in terms of these, you know, big landscapes. I have trouble with that, I guess. But anyway, it's a beautiful deck, and I know it's out of print now, and I know that there are people who would actually use this deck, whereas me, I've got it sitting on a shelf, and it's been sitting on a shelf, and it hasn't moved off the shelf, and I don't know how long. So again, why am I going to hoard it? I'm not. I'm going to pass it along to somebody who will love it and enjoy it and give it the attention that it deserves, because it is a beautiful deck. Just because it doesn't work for me doesn't mean it's not a wonderful deck. So anyway, so there you have it. That is the 10 most surprising decks that are leaving my collection. So we have the Majestic Earth Tarot. We have the Mythic Tarot. I'm not going to take these all out of the bag because we'll be here forever. The Revival Art, the Sacred Creators, the Darkness of Light, the Jolanda Tarot, my trimmed Archetypes deck, the Muse Tarot. I don't know where to put anything anymore. The Muse Tarot, the Second Nature Tarot, and the Everyday Witch. So there you go. The 10 most surprising decks leaving my collection. There are a total of 75 in the box, but most of those, not really surprises. These were the ones that I was like, am I sure? Am I really, really sure? At this point, yes, I'm really, really sure. Now, just in case anybody is interested in checking out the decks that I'm going to be culling for my collection, I will be posting them at some point, probably somewhere related to my website. So just keep an eye out there. I'll try to leave a post in the community or something when those go up. They're not up now. Don't bother going to look. I'm going to be moving them along in batches because otherwise it's just way too overwhelming, because I did that last time and yeah, that was a lot. So this time we're going to be moving them along in small batches. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this look at the 10 most surprising decks leaving my collection. I just thought this would be a fun one to do. I would love to know what your most surprising deck that you have moved out of your collection or that you've culled. I think that would be fun. So let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll chat with you again soon.